We are glorious and we are live. And we are the TForce LCS Rundown. This is your host, friend, and confidant, Modka Norum, as always. Joined by Optimist Tom.
I prefer to be a dark confidant because then I get to draw extra cards at a cost of a life total.
And Greg, Credible Mushroom, our newest member, our most loving member, and quite appropriately, it's not quite a bow tie, but it's not quite a tie.
It is a cravat, sir.
It is a cravat.
I was streaming some games the other day, and apparently a lot of our audience has no idea what that is, so I decided to throw it out.
I've seen it. I know what it theoretically is, but I didn't know what the name was. And I've heard the word cravat. Like, cravat isn't some word I've never been exposed to before. But if you were to ask me what that was, I would defer to your own knowledge.
You know what they call me on the street? They call me the Mac Daddy of the cravat. And that's for real.
I thought they were going to call you Freddy from Scooby-Doo, but then I remember that's an ascot, and so that's something completely different.
Well, man, don't cross that line, man.
If and when we bring off a fourth, we're going to have him wear an ascot. That's just going to be the absolute demand.
It'll tie it all together.
Where's Claude when you need him? All right, well, everybody, thank you for joining us live on the stream and on iTunes, Stitcher, or the rest. For those of you out in podcast land, sometime after Tuesday, we are the TForce LCS Rundown of the Trinity Force Podcast Network. You can find us at lcs.trinityforcepodcast.com. We'll be joining you live every Sunday night shortly after 9 p.m., wink, wink, on stream.trinityforcepodcast.com, and that's also on Twitch. So don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes, feedback at trinityforcepodcast.com. Other show news and show funness. We will be at PAX this year, and by we, I mean me, and I will be there toting Trinity Force Podcast t-shirts, maybe LCS Rundown t-shirts if we can get our ish together in enough time. And inside those lovingly warm and cuddly LCS t-shirts will be $10 NRP cards. So do not forget to find me. I will be there Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, all 3 days. First come, first serve. You must use the special keyword Optimal Tom to receive a shirt and prize. Of course, do not forget to check out our other shows, the Trinity Force Podcast, which airs on Monday and Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard. That's 7 Pacific, and Europe still don't know. Still didn't take the time to add that to the show notes.
Plus 8 hours, because thanks to Daylight Savings Time screwing us up for like another week and a half.
Oh, no. Yeah, it's going to be even worse for you guys.
So if it's Eastern Standard, that's going to be, what, midnight Europe time?
1 a.m.? I want to say 1 a.m.
But you guys are used to it.
Depends what part.
Yeah, it depends what part.
You guys are used to it because you have your time zone problems with the NALCS anyway. So
all the time.
Get over it. And then, of course, on Thursdays, the Oz LOL podcast will be live. So how was everybody's week? How are we liking the LCS now that we're out of IEM and we're out of Super Weeks and we're just back into a regular week of LCS goodness?
It was a great week for me personally. I made gold. Hey!
Woo! There you go.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I thankfully had time to make gold because there weren't nearly as many matches. So I'm down with that.
Well, I've been playing on my Smurf account very, very little, but I have been nonetheless. And I had somebody tell me that it was wrong for me to tell him to go back. He was attacking the top lane tower. It was wrong for me to tell him to go back because he didn't know where the rest of the team was, so there was no way for him not to know that they weren't going to come get him.
The counter logic game.
So I had to, and it's my fault, I'm playing with new people, so you have to accept logic quite like that. So I took a step back and went, maybe I shouldn't play this Smurf account anyway, and I went back on my main account. How about you, Optimist Tom?
I did get a chance to play a couple ranked games this week, which is few and far between for me, more recent times. I had a little bit of success, And then, so I'm somebody who likes when I usually play AD carry, but when I have to play another role, I like playing something a little non-traditional because I'm usually worse at that role, and therefore like to prey upon my opponent not knowing what my champion does too much. So I'll play like Karma in the mid lane. I'll play like Aatrox or something weird, a little bit more weird or used to be weird in the top lane. And I play Zyra as support, and I go full AP.
Ooh.
And I had an AD carry who unfortunately wasn't able to really go toe-to-toe in the laning phase. It was a Caitlyn against a Sivir, which isn't a good matchup to begin with. So I picked Zyra. I figured, well, I could kind of bully out this Caitlyn. Things will go okay. Didn't really work out. The Sivir wasn't, unfortunately, about 35 CS behind. And, of course, we lost the game because I picked Zyra. So it was fun.
I've been beasting on Renekton thanks to some tips from Ponophobia.
Ooh. I don't think there's too many of our fans yet who have never seen the TForce podcast. We get a lot of fans from that show. But if you haven't watched that show or you infrequently watch that show, go watch that show because they give some of the best tips. They changed my jungler life forever. And it's always a great time to have to listen in on that. So
yeah, but they won't tell you to play support, Victor, so don't listen too closely.
So let's hop right into the rumors for this week. Again, I don't think we do it every week, and I feel so bad for it, but thank you to Surrender at 20 for compiling so much great esports information. If you ever want to read something about what happened this week in the LCS, definitely head over to them. They're a great source of information. So Superhot Crew's Mops leaves and Selfie joins. What kind of impact do you guys think that this is going to have with Superhot Crew? Looking at the standings in the upcoming weeks, any kind of change kind of throws a wrench into the cogs here, so to speak, on the EU side. So what do you think this is going to do for the 7th place team? Is it going to be able to propel them up, or is it going to take them down?
Well, Selfie coming in, well, first off, it's awesome that his name is Selfie, but his name used to be Choyu, which unfortunately in Polish roughly translates to I want to dick you, which isn't really LCS applicable. So he changed his name to Selfie.
Balls? Is that why they kicked him off?
I'm pretty sure it's because nobody played Alistar in Season 3, but that's a completely different story. But so he comes in, and he's a very aggressive mid lane player. During that broadcast, they're hyping up all of his assassins. He played with MYM for a little bit after they got rid of Sharu, and he was kind of filling the void for a bit until they decided to go with somebody else. But he plays a very aggressive Katarina, a lot of mid laners that kind of are big playmakers, rather than Moops, who, well, he's been around since Season 1, and his champion pool kind of reflected that. He played a lot of Gragas. He started to pick up Ziggs, a lot of these wave clearing, team fight, wait for a little while to set something up, make a big play, and that's how you win the game mid laners. And it just wasn't working out for the rest of Super Hot Crew, who wanted to move around the map and use their dynamic bottom lane duo to start doing things earlier in the game. So they're at the bottom of the table now. I think it's going to be a step in the right direction for them. He's a younger face, he's a fresh face, and he kind of, when you bring in a new player, just revitalizes team atmosphere, which is going to be a big thing for them. But right now, unless they win out all their games, they're not going to be in that hypothetical first place tie. Will it be enough for them to avoid relegations? I could see it happening.
Yeah, I would sort of agree with Tom a little bit. It was obvious to me that Selfie was a bit nervous on his debut. There were a couple of early game misplays. But it seemed that in their second game against the Lions, he was a little more confident. He was synergizing well with his jungler. There was a lot of counter ganking, turning things around. So I would say that it'll probably take a while to warm up. I would say it's a little too late to expect him to seriously impact their current season, but if they can survive relegations, I think he's got a lot of potential, and maybe next year it'll put them in a stronger position if they can help build a team around him.
Well, hopping into the schedule very quick, just for this team, and we'll take a macro look at this a little bit later. In the upcoming games, I mean, they have, let's see, 1, 2, I think it's a total of 6 games. They play 4 times in week 11. Is that true?
Yeah,
1, 2.
last week's Super Week, so 4 games for everybody.
So 6 more games to make moves and to have this pickup be, an impact. And when the difference between being in relegation, not being in relegation is one. Well, for them, it's just 1 game. All they really need to do is start stepping up the places here in 2-3 games in the hole that another team doesn't pick up, and they're back in fighting shape to not be in relegations. Do you guys? I mean, when it really comes down to it, do you see this as something that's actually going to hold them back, or is this something that could potentially turn the season for them?
I don't see it as something that'll hold them back, but I have doubts that it's going to be enough to seriously change their current lot. I mean, they have a lot of games, but every other team has a lot of games too, and I think they're going to be a little bit more cohesive, and that's probably going to prevent Super Hot Crew from really, like I said, changing their overall position in the standings. If they avoid relegation, I think it'd be a minor miracle, personally.
Yeah.
No offense to them. I just think it's a little too late.
I'm kind of inclined to agree. Like, I want to believe in Super Hot Crew, and I want them to avoid relegation. But with the change coming this late in the schedule, and their next 2 matches are against Fnatic and Gambit, it's going to be a very steep slope. Like, Selfie's going to have to really prove himself in these games. Otherwise, Super Hot Crew, they're not going to be looking too okay. They have like 1 almost guaranteed win in the fact that they play Millennium 1 more time, which is just the fact that they're in 7th place, Millennium's in 8th place. That's why you would assume Super Hot Crew would win that game. But this schedule is not really
you.
That's also very true. But just looking at the way their schedule pans out, if they finish in 6th place, I think that's like their highest attainable goal right now.
Well, now, do you think Millennium's, and are getting onto our next point, Millennium's loss of Araneo, do you really think that's going to be a big deal, considering, as of the most recent information that I have, they're still looking for a replacement? I mean, how does that even factor in? Do they have a set of published subs out there, or?
As far as I know, they have no substitute for the jungler position, which is very, very troubling, especially like it's extremely troubling considering the fact that Aranea, first off, was like, not only is he an older player, not only is he an established name in the community, he was passionate, and he was the emotional stronghold for that team. In season 3, like there was an interview that ESL did with him at Sao Paulo, where he was like sitting outside and going through all the stuff at the end of season 2 with SK and making it into alternate in season 3, and how he held together the team emotionally, how he helped Kurt transition into mid lane, how he got Krayaton over some of his hard times, and picking up Kevin and lightening the mood of the entire team. He takes very harsh criticism of himself. And if there's a problem with the team, he redirects it to himself to try to lighten the load for everybody else. So if Dad is gone from the team and you don't have cohesion, you don't have practice with a new player in the unit, and things go wrong, that team's going to implode.
Well, I don't even think it's going to take much for things to go wrong. I mean, he was I think the phrase from other sports would be like a locker room leader. A big source of morale for the team, and they're already in last place. So, that's obviously going to be an issue for them. No one likes being in that position psychologically. So, I think this is fairly devastating for them. I mean, I don't think it's realistic to think that they're going to avoid relegation by any stretch of logic. I think the real question is going to be whether or not they can make it through the relegations, which, if Aranea does not participate in, I would have serious doubts.
Well, if you are listening to the recording of this podcast, this is recorded, we're talking about, this is 9:18 Eastern Standard on Sunday. So release on Tuesday. If we found a replacement by them, it'll be a much different story. But they are up first, 2 p.m. on Thursday against the Copenhagen Wolves.
Well, realistically, who could they replace him with that would have a game-changing impact? Is there anyone out there that comes to mind?
The problem is in Europe, there are a lot of free agent players or players they could use as a sub to transition. Anybody who's been knocked out of the Coke League is an eligible participant, at least until the end of the split. And some of those teams, some of those players aren't really going to have a shot to make it into the LCS anyway. Like some of the teams, because the Coke League is a point system, some of those teams that are sitting around like, the 2 or 5 or whatever it is point mark, like only the top 6 teams in points get in. So anybody who might lose out on tie breaks or lose out in a tiebreaker situation, they're an eligible substitute replacement. Because if you've played in 1 week of LCS, you can't play for that week in Coke League, to my knowledge. Mm-hmm. So free agent substitutes, you have a plethora of lower seeded challenger teams with talented individual players that they could pick up. Off the top of my head, though, thinking about like the top junglers in Europe, they're all 16. Mm-hmm. So they can't play in LCS. Like Amin and Ku, they are completely no-go. Like the biggest name to my knowledge I could think of would be like a Maluno, who I don't even know if he's been playing recently, to be honest. So it's very difficult. You could, of course, maybe have like an NIP player step in, but they're moving on to the finals of Coke League. They won't be able to play until Super Week. So,
well, I find it really interesting because if you haven't read his Facebook post yet, definitely go out and do that. Deciding to step down like this, it's a little troubling to see that the team didn't have a replacement. Do you have any further insights as to exactly why this went down? I mean, a lot of what he mentions in his post, a lot of it breaks down into performance. But when you take a macro look at it, you have your performance under question, but your team doesn't have a replacement. Why leave all of a sudden? Why kind of drop out like that? Without a replacement, maybe they have a set in mind and they're just not talking about it, or...
There's a couple things that could factor into this. One is what you just mentioned there. They could have a sub and they just don't want to announce it until they have to announce it so that players have less information scouting on them. Mm-hmm. Another thing is he could be publicly announcing it so that they could try out players during the week, see who they have a good cohesion with, see who's a good individual player. Mm-hmm. And if they don't find anybody, he can still play because he's still technically on the team. So they would still have him available. As far as individual performances go, something that always troubles me with Aranea is how hard he is on himself. Currently, he's 37, 81, and 127. Looking back at the last split, he was 64 and 105. So he's gotten less kills, but he's also died less, even though there are 6 games left. Looking at it right now, he would still end with less deaths than he did last split. Mm-hmm. However, the glaring difference is 127 current assists compared to 230 that he had in the previous split. So Aranea himself is taking on all this punishment saying, I am not performing extremely well. But when you look at the rest of their team from last split, Kerp, 91 kills, 78 currently. Kraton, 90 kills this season, 130, and he was out for 2 weeks last split. The entire team is underperforming. Granted, jungler and mid lane are very important roles to kind of carry in this metagame right now, but Kerp just recently switched this season. Aranea might not be performing the best, but he's not dying as much, and they're kind of being a little bit smarter about engagements. It's just such a dicey situation, and I think, honestly, the mentality of the team at this point is these last weeks of LCS are to prep us as much as possible before relegation.
Sure. I mean, it's really interesting to see whether this decision came down to loss of love of the game. I mean, when you're this critical on yourself and you have, a very critical internet presence out there, and you're at the bottom of your division, is this the kind of step down where he's out for good and he's just walking away from the scene and maybe he'll go on to more of a game support role where he's either coaching or being an analyst? Or is he looking to be picked up by another team where maybe he has a better opportunity to perform? It's interesting to me to see the ability for a person to drop out. And I understand there's a lot of factors that obviously go into it, and I can't say how I would make that same decision, but I always find it very interesting, this concept of retirement and what that ends up meaning to an individual player. And I'm trying my best not to call out any particular players individually, mostly because I'm sure everybody has different reasons for retiring, but it seems like a very flip-floppy position at this point where you can kind of step in and out of teams. And to me, a good part of the drama of the LCS is waiting to see how teams move around and where players can end up being.
I think it's a bit of a drawback to the LCS in general, that kind of player mobility and fluidity. It causes more confusion for the viewers. We saw this like pretty crystal clear earlier on in the split where teams were changing names, players were dropping and switching over, the whole thing with teams buying out each other and converting names but keeping players. And I mean, if you want to talk about the LCS appeal to a mass viewing audience, you can't keep that like that. Is not a sustainable culture. It has to get more stable.
I mean, it's very difficult because a lot of the motivations behind team names are usually sponsorships. What kind of, who's basically willing to give them money to have their name plastered onto the group, and at what point, I guess, does a team stop becoming a team because their roster has changed so much? Who is the CLG that everybody loves? Is it the name, or is it the particular group of players? And I think that also transcends into real sports as well. And I said real sports there. That's not a fair assessment.
Physical sports.
Physical sports.
More established sports.
More established sports is a good way of putting it. I would love to see League of Legends pick up an official draft system. I think the way that players enter into the LCS is great right now. With relegations, it puts the onus on the individual teams to really step up and play well throughout the year, and not just trying to pick up a rush for positioning in the playoffs or the end of the splits. But I would love to see it if in order to become a sub, in order to make it onto an already established teams, and in order for these teams to make moves within themselves, they have to enter into a certain draft system. And they have to, essentially, they have bracketed times where they're allowed to make roster changes and they're allowed to move things around. Now, granted, that's going to majorly affect teams who don't have the support structure of having a full roster of subs and having a backup system where if one player needs to drop out for whatever reason, they have nothing to go back onto. But I think it's definitely something that is a little chaotic. It does mess with, I think a lot of the perception of the fans as to how the games are going, and it would be an interesting thing to see where it comes up in the future.
I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult to implement a direct draft system for an LCS, because not only let's put a couple factors on the table right now. I guess just throwing out as much information as possible right now. One, it's not as sustainable as a more established sports career. There's no multi-million-dollar contracts out of the drafting phase. There's no secured 1 or 2 years worth of pay. Hence, it could just be a split's worth, and you might not get the full amount of money from said team or split. There's the fact that a lot of these players know about this, so there is school involved still for those players, and at any given point in time, a team signing a player because they have a good performance and say they're going to commit could just drop out due to school reasons, which, tying back in with Aranea, could be something else. He recently finished up school. He was going for his exams at the beginning of this split. He finished the exams, kept playing, wasn't performing well. Now he might just be saying, well, I finished school, I could go get a real job. Maybe I'm piecing out. Could be another factor in that one. Another one is the career lifespan of an LCS player could be limited to 1 split, could be, at this point, 4 seasons. Not everybody is a Skara and can continue playing on and on and on. St. Vicious was, 26 years old, and he's still fighting with the word retirement at this point in time. Aranea has cited recently that he's 24 going on 25. That's old for a League of Legends player. 17 years old is how young you can be to play in the LCS, and that's a Bjergsen, that's a Wild Turtle, or now Turtle's a little bit older, but it was a Wild Turtle. It was all these players that come in and make that huge impact and turn a team completely completely around. So in that expectancy between 17 and 24, most of these players stop playing by the time they're 20. The average age in LCS is probably 18, 19 years old. So if you don't get drafted in that system, if you're floating around for a very long time, once you're 20 years old, that could be it. You could play for that one split and you have to be done. Like, it's a little bit more difficult.
And this isn't exactly, and I recognize there are some schools of thought about, player reaction times and stuff like that. But this isn't exactly football where players still play till their 30s. This is considerably less physically demanding. If anything, experienced players should over younger players, especially, amazing skill aside, this is still a developing thing, but I would expect Wild Turtle in 2 years is still probably going to be better than most ADCs.
Sure.
So if we're going to talk about the age limitations of the LCS, I think we should talk about, structurally, whether that's a good setup right now, or if we should be pushing more of, say, the college scene, which is developing, and then have some kind of feeder system off that, like a lot of traditional sports.
I think a draft system plays well to the life expectancy of an LCS player. It gives them the opportunity to enter into a system, an opportunity that, unless they had a really great team behind them, they may or may not have had the opportunity to do. It lets them enter in and, prove their worth, and allows the players who are really good, really able to play within the system. I'm trying to find the best words to have the mental capacity to play in the LCS without saying mental capacity. But, the right kind of personality to play in that system and justify their age in the group. I mean, obviously Scarra's a great person to have with Dignitas. And, if you take a look at Scarra, what do you think Scarra could do on a better team? What could Scarra do on TSM as their mid if Bjergsen wasn't in the picture? And I just think having a draft system where players are entering and leaving at different points, it does increase the confusion, but I think it solidifies the idea of a team and what a team name is and what that, philosophy behind the team is. And it gives more players more opportunity to play.
I was gonna cut you off really quick, but another glaring issue of the draft system implemented in the LCS is, while it works in more established sports such as football, for example, you don't have a Miami Dolphins or New York Jets fighting for their NFL career against an Ohio State or a Michigan.
That is very true. That's very true.
It's extremely difficult to say, okay, here are all these challenger teams. They're all in this draft system. My biggest issue currently is with Robert X. Lee. And I think this kind of ties in very well. First off, Complexity Black, high contender for LCS promotion relegation. Second issue, he is a sub for XDG. Third issue, why the fuck is he playing for Evil Geniuses?
I have no idea.
Wait, hold on. He's a sub for XDG?
He is a sub for XDG Gaming, and he is playing with Evil Geniuses.
Did they trade him? Is that how this works?
Well, here's the thing. In an open draft system, somebody could pick that person up. Maybe if they're a sub for another team, they're more inclined to play for that team. But let's face it right now, XDG has gone through numerous roster changes, and I've never put Robert in. Robert could just be saying, well, you know what? Screw you guys. I'm going to Evil Geniuses. So unless there's potentially salary or some motivation or B teams for these players to play on, like if Complexity Black was XDGB, that could be a completely different story, and there'd be more reason to have more loyalty for that player or those positions. And there'd also be more flexibility in having that team use subs or a reason to call them up from the bench to participate in that week. It's just, there's so many other factors, I think, caused by the challenger scene or caused by personal player motivation to go to other teams or stay with their own team or whatever, that while a drafting system would be amazing for the LCS to keep these teams in it, it's so frustrating to think like, well, if that's the case, then no other new teams get in, but we get to keep these teams in. And
I don't think it's necessarily exclusive. I mean, you could still have drafts and still have, teams get the boot.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily 100% sold on a draft as a concept because I do think a little bit of free agency is good too. And League of Legends is a bit unique in that we have the challenger circuit, we've got challenger teams, we've got challenger players. It's a lot easier for an amateur players, in quotes, a non-LCS player that's maybe not attached to a team to try to get involved compared to say somebody walking off the street and joining an NFL team. I like that aspect of it, and I like that teams have to fight for their spots.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
I
think
know
having
that.
2 splits is a little bit too much, but go ahead.
I didn't know anything about Robert X. Lee. I knew he was playing for EG this week, but I didn't know he had his hands in so many honeypots. I'd be really interested to see, and I don't know if this information is public or if it's even relegated by Riot, but I would love to see what the contract structure is for some of these teams, because you're getting paid a salary, quote unquote. I don't know how that actually works, boils down, but the company is paying you money to be in this league. So how does that work when it comes to somebody leaving? Are you leaving everything on the table and you're just, you're basically giving up your housing and moving home? Or what's going on there that these players are able to move so freely?
I'd say it's just unique to each team. Like, nobody really knows the specific details involved in individual contract, but I mean, you have termination dates that are posted on the players' sites. Riot makes these teams publish those dates and everything, but to a certain extent, like, you would be signing for a year, you'd be signing for a split. Each contract is a little bit different, but I mean, I can't really speak for teams. I can't speak for Riot. I can't speak for players. It's just,
I don't know. I see that as a very dangerous system, and I see that as a very unhealthy system, because when you get a team who's maybe not so solidified in their own roster, you have a management issue where you can really screw with things. I don't know. That puts just the tiniest seed of doubt. I think that definitely needs to be looked at a lot more, is the way that these teams are structured and how everything comes in, because it's, I don't know.
I do know
the wrong way.
I do know that this is an issue with Good Game University, now Team Coast, when they had the shifter visa issues and he wasn't able to play for them. So they had Fat subbing in, they had Jinte subbing in. I believe they had someone else playing for a week or two, but those substitute players were mandated in a undetermined amount of pay. So it's not like these substitute players are coming in, whereas the established player gets the full contract salary and they get absolutely nothing. There's rules in place that I'm not aware of entirely, and I know it may just be team specific or league specific. I have no idea, but subs do get paid for the amount of time they play.
Sure. Well, I mean, I could see it, with the amount of money allotted that's structured for everything. You could probably get a proportion of it, but I think we've pretty much beat that discussion to death at this point.
Let me give you one more point of it.
Okay.
So if you want to talk funding,
before we dive away
want to talk
from
funding, if you want to talk
again.
player stability, you want to talk team stability, what do you guys think about moving away from splits and just going to year seasons?
It would be fantastic, but then you would have Velocity winning 5 games over a year instead of 5 games in one split and then getting their asses kicked out.
Yeah. I do like the relegation split. I think that's a really good opportunity to really revitalize it and freshen it up. I mean, at this point, how many more times do we want to watch EG lose? It gets to that point where you kind of do want to see it freshen up and step up.
I would like a full year-long season.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, I like the diversity of teams in a split system a little bit more. And there's no way to really be able to make it fair that if you had a full season and teams would go in and out and carry over from last split and blah, 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 blah. I don't know. A full season would be really awesome. I just feel like maybe you would just make each split a little bit longer and have it be a full year-round thing, but then there's no break period for teams that
would be awful.
Full seasons. So
I love watching lots of LCS games, but
a full year's worth.
A full year is a bit much, and having the splits is because it leads to awkward situations where you've got like a middle of the year champion, which is really awkward and no other sport has.
That is a weird factor that kind of just gets peppered in there. Nobody really takes the time to think about it, but how often do the rules of a game change? Potentially, I guess, when do they introduce new patches into the LCS? Like, when do they actually finally cut over like a major point patch?
To the tournament realms, normally 2 weeks behind.
So theoretically, this is totally theoretically, you could change factors about the game 5 times in a split if the game merits that many changes.
I'd say counting playoffs, because normally they'll be released on a Tuesday, and then LCS is on that last patch, and then there's the 2-week period after. So I'd say like 5 times with playoffs. Yeah, something like
Sure.
that.
That's pretty unprecedented. Like,
Well,
And it offers a little room for dynamism that, you don't necessarily need entire new teams coming in. If you did change the structure such that instead of 2 splits, it was a longer but not as long as 2 splits professional season with relegation happening in that brief period between the off-season and the end of, say, the World Championships. You could have new players coming in, maybe not teams changing their entire roster, but instead of, say, a split, you have a free agency period specifically designed where teams can make significant roster changes. You could have new elements of the game coming out, new champions, new item changes, etc., that some teams will be able to master and some players will be able to master and others won't. You don't necessarily need entirely new teams coming in every couple months to keep things fresh. And having some teams stay around longer will enable their management to get more organized. Players will be able to have more stability. Sponsors will be able to have more certainty. And fans will be able to get more attached to certain groups over others.
I guess the biggest issue with that is coming from someone who, during Season 3, thrived on the upcoming Cloud9s and Velocities and had the Rising Star Invitational to cast and everything. If you have, let's say the split is, 3 months long, and you could extend it to a full season that's maybe like 5 months long or something like that.
Sure.
What do challenger teams do for the other 7 months of the year?
very true. You could just play less games per week. Less interesting for us, sure. But, I mean, if you dropped 1 game off each week, you could squeak 2 weeks out of that. An extra 2 weeks. Squirt off 2. Now you've got 4.
Then you don't have every single team playing guaranteed every week, though.
Yeah, which that's not necessarily bad.
And
I
it's
mean,
not-
Lots of sports teams have off weeks.
yeah.
They have
but-
one off week, though. And they
Right.
did have that in Season 3. But it also panned out to some teams playing 3 games, some teams playing 1 game, and then the standings are like, well, this team is 25-4, but this team has all their games played already, but they're ahead of them in wins, but behind them in losses. And how do we figure that out? And it's like, well, win
Or
ratio.
just cut games in half. Have each team play once a week.
That could work.
Maybe
What
it's
are
a,
we,
a best
NFL?
of 3 for. Hey, I don't think that's necessarily that bad. I mean, one of the downfalls of hockey, which is my favorite sport, but it's
Okay,
really
good.
hard to follow because teams play a frick ton of games. Even if
lot.
it's your favorite team, you can't watch every game they play. It's ridiculous.
Well, you said my favorite word in there very quickly, which was best of 3, which is a different topic entirely. But moving away from a best of 1 LCS system is my personal
Yeah.
favorite solution.
Well, before we hop onto that deep dark hole of us all arguing about it but agreeing at the same time, let's take a look at the standings for the EU and the NALCS. If you're listening to this recording live, new thing we're going to try out this week. For the podcast people, you will have already been read the standings. So for those of you watching live in the chat room, You will not hear that this week, and that's something we're probably just going to move to from now on. But taking a look at the standings on NA, we're going to do NA very quickly, just blow through because at this point it's not that interesting. And then we'll hop into EU and finish out the episode there.
Which is super interesting.
So NA standings as of this week, wrapping up what was this week 9 going into next week, week 10. We have TSM commanding at 19-3. Followed by Cloud9 just on their heels at 18-4. CLG trailing behind at number 3 at 14-8. Curse 9-13. Dignitas 9-13. Coast 7-15. EG 6-16. And XDG, even though they had some convincing play today, still sitting also tied with EG 6-16. So the real story here in the NALCS, unfortunately, is which team is going to be facing the tournament round of relegation. That is in the spring split tournaments, the 6th place team after everything will also face relegation. And it's really what team is going to be sitting down there facing extinction once more. I don't really see EG or XDG being able to pull themselves fully out of this hole. Unfortunately, EG just today getting destroyed by C9. I had all these hopes that after IEM, C9 was going to be tired 2 super weeks in a row, essentially coming in and like really give EG this like super running chance and energy to pump up. And
I think even if EG had their roster, not even close.
Yeah, it was just, it was bad. And XTG, I mean, they had some pretty convincing gameplay today. Or it was either today or yesterday. They managed to beat Curse, which good for them. But yeah, today. I don't know if they can pull it off. And I mean, CLG has been pulling off their consistency. They've been doing great. Curse, I mean, losing today, but still on a hot streak. It may have just been an off game. Who knows? And Dignitas just kind of being in that middle ground that they seem to love so much. I really see this as a 4, 5, and 6 game, and not even close to being a 1 or 2 game or a 7 or 8 game. So, any more thoughts on the NALCS?
It all comes down to whether or not Coast get their shit together. Period. I think that's the gatekeeper to 6th place right there.
And I think they did pretty well against CLG today. CLG, they won that game. They won it convincingly, but Coast made a concerted effort at almost all points of that game to actually really push it. And usually that was CLG reacting to it fairly decently and being able to crush it. But at least they just didn't break and let CLG run them down. They actually put out a pretty solid effort. And I think that if they put that up against the lesser teams out there, they're definitely going to keep their head above water for the rest of this season. So
a lot of their power came from Shifter. He was just nuts on Ziggs today.
Oh, yeah, and he got that quadra kill at Baron. It was just, I mean, they played very well.
Ooh, excuse me.
It's easy to say.
Bless you. And I think Coast has, a pretty decent schedule looking forward. Next week, week 10, they're up against XGG and EG. They're playing mini golf, and everybody else is...
Yeah, they've got a fair chance at those.
I think they've got more than a fair chance. I think unless XGG really steps it up and actually makes some solid moves, that's just going to be another loss, which is the nail in the coffin for them. And I just don't think EG has what it takes at this point to clear that up.
I've got to lean towards the XDG versus Coast game. I wouldn't maybe call it game of the week because there's some pretty big matches like CLG TSM going on, but this one could really decide like who gets that 6th place spot or not, just due in part to tiebreakers. And I think the big focus has to be on the jungle in that one. Like I know he gets a lot of flack, but watching his play from way back at IPL 4 until now, I really got to give a shout out to Nintendude from Coast because he was under Aranea level criticism. And instead of taking that flack and breaking down with it, he's tried really hard to expand his champion pool. In recent times, we've seen his Vi predict flashes. We've seen him adapt more carry-oriented junglers, whereas he was more of a, I hope I get my team snowballing, if not, I'm useless. He played Kha'Zix this game. While he had a couple missed jumps in some places where they could have turned fights around completely, he had some fairly good ganks in the early game, which is what their team composition really needed. They had a Renekton who they needed to get going early on for Zion Spartan to carry them through the lull, where Lucian could get a Trinity Force or have his mid-game power spike, where Ziggs can get his first big damage dealing item so they could team fight properly. And he was doing what he had to do in that composition, and it was really Zion Spartan not pulling his weight in that game. So I think
agree with you. The focal point's going to be the jungle, but I'm going to disagree. I think all eyes need to be on Xmithy.
Yes.
He's been looking a lot more comfortable. I mean, the whole lane swap thing has probably been, or not lane swap, but role swap has been talked to death. But it can't be said enough. That was such a huge mistake for XDG to split. And they finally corrected it. Obviously, a little too late for them to do much in terms of being competitive for one of the higher places in the rankings. But they're looking more and more like their old selves. Now, aside from the fact they lost to TSM, which tons of teams are doing, they won their other game against Curse. And I think they're looking pretty good. And I'm actually going to pull for them in that match.
Well, the interesting thing is that they do actually have wins on every team but TSM. So I think as long as the schedule, and I'm going to take a quick look at this here off screen, if the schedule plays into XGG's hands and they get some really solid wins, I think that's the only point where they have the chance, because mentally going into the game, you've beaten this team before. You know what it takes. No matter how it happened, you've felt that victory. That's the first really big point in mentally winning this. I mean, taking a look at their schedule, they have Team Coast ahead of them, CLG. Those are both games in Week 10. Then Week 11, the beginning of the Super Week, they have Cloud9, they have Dignitas, they have TSM, and then they have EG. So
Super Week's going to be a big week for them.
The Super Week, that last game is probably, I mean, I did some math, I think, last week looking into this week. I had them with a possible win over Curse, Dignitas, or sorry, Coast, Dignitas, and
EG.
Yeah, EG. I actually had them as an unlikely winner against Curse, and I think, did they beat Curse? Or did
They
they
did.
just win? Yeah, so they beat. Yeah, I mean, I think if they win those key games, you know, they have a chance of going into XTG and or going against TSM and winning. As
Really?
funny as that might sound, I think TSM may hang up their hat.
I have
may
to
just
say,
rest on their laurels, and XTG could make a comeback, big comeback.
I have to say the TSM game, we might be able to wash that one off as a loss, but I think the biggest game for XDG in the coming weeks is going to be that game against Cloud9. Now, the biggest thing about this team is they were second place last season. The one thing that's changed has been Bloodwater. And while Bloodwater was regarded as being the shot caller for their team back then, they have Sheep, who, as we've seen, is very vocal. He's very awesome in interviews. He talks a lot in those. He kind of spits out what he's saying. Between him and Zuna, as well as Smithy now back in the jungle, I feel like the communication in that team is still extremely strong. They're all back in their roles from when they made it to Worlds. The one thing that's changed is Sheep and Bloodwater. Back then, Bloodwater played a lot of Sona. It was his most played champion by far, and I believe his second closest one was Thresh. Now you have Sheep. He plays Thresh. He plays Leona. He could play a lot of more aggressive champions, which, as we saw in the game against Curse, synergized extremely well with Zuna playing a carry like Jinx, who wants to kill things and then run at the enemy team. So this team is looking, if they have their shit together, so to say, they're looking like a team that could go against Cloud9. And let's not forget, they were Cloud9's kryptonite last split. That exact team in that exact role, I think that's the big make or break game right there. if things play out in their favor, if they win that game, they avoid relegation.
Well,
I hate. Can I just go on the record saying I hate how the story from NA is not that TSM and Cloud9 are within one game of each other, and they're two of the most dominant versions of these teams we've ever seen.
Just doesn't. It just
and
doesn't
no,
matter.
it's all about the last place teams.
It just doesn't matter.
That
But
annoys the shit out of me.
let's just really quickly wrap up our discussion on NA with Greg. Let's go through your picks for this week. I do have the results of last week's picks and who won that week for predictions. So, Greg, Dignitas or EG?
It depends. Is EG going to have the regular roster next week?
Probably
According to Twitter, they should be back next week.
Can I get a qualifier? If the full EG roster plays, I'm
No.
going to call EG.
Call it.
I'll call EG anyway.
EG. CLG versus TSM.
TSM.
Coast versus XDG.
XDG.
XDG. Curse on C9.
Cloud9.
Let in that for you. CLG, XDG.
Ooh. You preventively fill in XCLG. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go with XCG on that one. I feel like they're going to be hot.
Curse on TSM.
TSM.
C9 on Dignitas.
C9.
All right. And EG over Curse.
Coast, you mean?
Coast.
Probably going to go with Coast on that one. I want EG to win, but Coast is looking hot. I don't think it's quite as hot as Tom thinks they are. But we'll see.
We'll see.
The water is warm in California. That coast is pretty hot.
All right. And just to what I alluded to earlier, taking a look at the score from last week. For those of you who didn't join us last week, we are having Greg, Incredible Mushroom, pick his top LCS games from the NA side, picking the winners. And Optimus Tom is going to be picking the EU. We are going to compare scores each week, and the winner at the end, the person with the most points, will win something fun and nice.
It's a bow tie.
So yes, it's an official LCS bow tie, TForce LCS bow tie. So Optimus Tom, you lost this week.
I did. I got upset by my baby Overpow.
Yep, you got 5 picks right, not correctly picking SK over. You picked SK over Roccat. Roccat won.
Yep.
You picked Roccat against Fnatic. Fnatic won, and you picked Gambit over Alliance, and Alliance won.
It was the Fnatic one that killed you, Tom. I don't know why you would ever bet against them.
I feel like the one that made the biggest impact for me, and I very briefly just want to mention this game because I know we're running low on time, and this is like the game of the week from EU, and we did a lot of NA and a lot of breakdown discussion, but Roccat versus SK. First off, this game screwed me in the predictions. Second off, holy crap, I was so excited about this game. Even though I lost the prediction, I was so excited for Roccat finally playing like Roccat again. Couple big things stood out for me. First off, top lane Lulu won a game. Hasn't done that since Soaz played it against Gambit, and it was technically on the bottom lane in that game because role swaps, blah, 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 blah. Lulu, Gragas win a game together. Jenkos looked phenomenal on Elise, 6-0 and 4, and he focused down on the bottom lane. Celiver's average CS stats have been suffering since teams have banned away or picked away Caitlyn and Lucian from him. He picks Jinx and they pair it with a Sona. These people can't get away from anything in this bottom lane. So what do? They send the jungler down there 3 or 4 times and they demolish. Elise never dies. Jinx never dies. They run over SK, and I think it was like 30-minute game or something like that. And this is SK who could have taken first place for themselves with this game. They had a hyper carry in Jax. They had a LeBlanc to try to make plays. Guess what? They got 0 kills. The only one with kills was Svenskaren's jungle Kha'Zix, and it doesn't work when Kha'Zix is the only person with kills in the game. Trust me, I've watched plenty of Alex Itch. It doesn't work that way. Roccat got me so excited, so I'm so ready for these predictions now.
All right, well, let's just really quickly run through the standings.
Wait, doesn't he have to make his calls?
No, wait just a moment, sir. Order of operations.
Put it down,
here.
buddy.
All right, we've got Gambit Gaming 13-9, SK Gaming 13-9, Roccat 12-10, Alliance 12-10, Fnatic 12-10, Copenhagen Wolves 10-12, Super Hot Crew 9-13, Millennium 7-15. It's so close in the EU LCS now, and like I wasn't a EU LCS fan coming into the show really ever in general, and I just can't help but to not watch these games now. Like it's way too exciting. I look at the schedule, and with NA I can go like, all right, this game will be good because these are good teams, and here are two good teams that are going up against each other. That I don't have that option in EU anymore. You have to watch them all. And it's just like, this is, I think, the first week where I'm like, all right, well, Millennium versus Copenhagen Wolves, I can probably skip that. But I feel like the second I do skip that, it's going to be, oh my God, that was the best game ever. Totally changed our way of perspective. Let's talk about it all next show.
Yeah, I'm actually hyped for that match.
All right. So, Tom, give us our rundown. Millennium versus Copenhagen Wolves.
Copenhagen Wolves.
Cool. SK Gambit Gaming. Should be an awesome game.
I'm going to have to side with Gambit because it's a first place decider match.
Rocket versus
Alliance is on a hot streak, but I can't go against Overpower anymore. He burned me once. I'm going with Rocket.
Super Hot Crew on Fnatic.
I'm going to have to go with Fnatic.
See, I'm predicting
He's learned his lesson.
on the sheet as well. So, okay, SK versus Alliance.
Ooh. Both of these teams, if my predictions go right, are going to be angry about a loss. I'm going to go with Alliance.
Ooh.
I'm
feeling
going to test the
Alliance.
waters a little.
I like Alliance a lot. Super Hot Crew on Gambit Gaming.
Little known fact, Super Hot Crew have the fastest game in the EU LCS, beating Gambit the last time these two teams met. It's not going to happen. Gambit's going to win.
Fnatic on Millennium.
Fnatic.
And then Rocket, Copenhagen Wolves.
I'm going to have to say that cats are better than dogs.
Ooh. You would be wrong. I keep burping.
I would
Yes.
100% be wrong with that one if it wasn't Rocket Cats against Wolves. Come on. They're,
But it's those Wolves
from
man, the
Copenhagen.
Copenhagen Wolves.
Come on.
yeah, but, well, they're red, they're white, they're Danish Dynamite, but they're not Polish-powered Rocket Cats.
You should write that down.
Oh,
That was entirely credited to. Do you ever see the Spazzy video with Deficio started casting,
No.
where he dubs over them and Joe's like blah 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 blah, and he's like, well, there's a saying in Denmark which is we're red, we're white, we're Danish Dynamite, therefore Copenhagen Wolves win the game.
Oh, awesome.
I
Awesome.
do believe Poland has a red and white flag as well, but I could just be entirely wrong and mixing up my geography and making a lot of enemies right now.
Well, we are out of time. I think all next week we're just going to devote an entire... You know what? Yeah, I'm putting it on paper now. We're devoting our entire next episode all to the EU LCS because we talk about NA and I lead the discussion in NA, and every week I'm like, we'll do it really quick, we'll get it out of the way, there's nothing interesting, and then we spend all of our time talking about it.
I feel like what we should do is, because it's so tight with EU, I think what we need to do is we need to pinpoint on one game in each region, especially since it's just a normal week. We each take one game, which could be the decisive sixth place game in NA and the first place game in EU or something. But I feel like each region has one featured game that we really should break down a little bit. And then the rest of the games, if there's more excitement in EU than NA or vice versa, we could shift it that way.
Well, why don't you guys out there in podcast and live chat land tell us, what would you rather see? Do you like our current approach where we're taking sort of a top view of each game, picking out the stuff that's really important, the stuff that was really game-changing, but overall trying our best to hit as many points as possible? Or do you want to see us dive into one particular set of games? I feel like on the NA side, that's probably really easy, but on EU, it's like, well, here's the top 10 games. That was really important this week.
8 games a week, and they have 10 top games because of tiebreakers.
Awesome.
I have
But,
a mailbag.
Ooh,
Which
and we
that's
do
interesting.
have the last point we have on our mailbag, and thank you for the listener. I don't have the information in front of you, but thank you for the listener who submitted it. The theory of champ select discussion is something that will come in the future, but we need to do a lot of research before we go into the land of speculation.
To be
that can
completely
be
honest,
champ
though,
select.
we probably have to do less research than EG.
Oh, Zingers coming out already.
Shots fired.
So, little preview of things to come. Please, please, please continue to send in feedback at trinityforcepodcast.com. We do listen to that. We do read it. We do take it into consideration. We absolutely love hearing it. So, thoughts on the show, send them in there. Hit us up on Twitter. We are all individually on Twitter. I am tweeting at Machinorum. Optimus Tom, you're tweeting at...
I'm at Optimus Tom. So easy.
And Greg Credible Mushroom, you are tweeting at
GRRUSSO.
That's Grusso. And we are the TForce LCS Rundown. Thank you for joining us. Do not forget that we are live Sunday nights at 9 p.m., just shortly after 9 p.m., as we round up here just shortly after 10 p.m. We are going live podcast land every Tuesday night. We are on stream.trinityforcepodcast.com for the stream, lcs.trinityforcepodcast for our website. Do not forget to come find me at PAX in a couple of weeks. Do not forget to listen to the Trinity Force podcast on Mondays and Wednesdays and the Oz LOL podcast on Thursdays. This is the podcast signing out.
Bye.
See you. Such an abrupt end this week. It's just like talk, end.